Good evening. That was the sound of Jade Cook of Cleveland Memorial Pipe Band in Bangor, County Down, piping with some of Belfast's best loved landmarks in the background. It's an appropriate, albeit virtual welcome, to what a French visitor to the city in the late 1700s described as somewhere with almost entirely the look of a Scotch town, and the character of the inhabitants has considerable resemblance to that of the people of Glasgow. The way of speaking is much more Scotch than Irish. Tonight, thanks to the efforts of many friends of the Linen Hall Library and with the support of the Ulster Scots Agency, we will be looking more deeply at those connections or the shock between Scotland and Ireland. My name is Scott Edgar, and I'm the Assistant Arts and Cultural Programmer at Belfast's Linen Hall Library. Now, the old story goes that all Edgars in Ulster descend from settlers from Nithsdale in Dumfriesshire many generations ago. That same Nithsdale, close by where Rabbie Burns made his home in 1788. As a wean, I sang Auld Lang Syne and Ye Banks and Braes at Bonnie Doon, and spent much of my childhood with my granny, who spoke a very unique version or dialect of Ulster Scots. While Rabbie built his Ellisland farm homestead in 1788, across the water, the townsfolk of Belfast established the Belfast Library and Society for Promoting Knowledge. Now, fondly known as the Linen Hall Library, it's the oldest such institution in the city, and the only library in Ireland still drawing a proportion of its income from membership. So, if you enjoy this evening's event, please do visit our website and find out more on how you can become a member of the Linen Hall Library. Tonight, we will look at the connections between Scotland, Ulster, Burns and Belfast, and in particular at the collection of works compiled by Andrew Gibson, an unrivaled collection in Ireland acquired by the Linen Hall Library 120 years ago this week. Gibson was an Ayrshirman who later settled in Belfast, bringing with him his passion for poetry and his love of Burns. And though well settled in Ulster, his heart remained in the Highlands. My Heart is in the Highlands is one of many poems within the Gibson Collection, and it's a favourite of our old friend, actor and director Dan Gordon.
My heart's in the Highlands. Farewell to the Highlands, farewell to the North, the birthplace of valour, the country of worth. Wherever I wander, wherever I rove, the hills of the Highlands forever I love. My heart's in the Highlands, my heart is not here. My heart's in the Highlands, a chasing the deer, a chasing the wild deer and following the roe. My heart's in the Highlands wherever I go. Farewell to the mountains high covered with snow, farewell to the straths and green valleys below. Farewell to the forests and wild hanging woods, farewell to the torrents and loud pouring floods. My heart's in the Highlands, my heart is not here. My heart's in the Highlands, a chasing the deer, chasing the wild deer and following the roe. My heart's in the Highlands, wherever I go.
Earlier this year, Scottish presenter Ali Heather paid a visit to the Linen Hall Library to meet with head librarian Samantha McComb, broadcaster and blogger Mark Thompson, and musician Sarah Carlyle. Together, they explored some of the highlights of the Gibson Collection.
The old heart of modern Belfast has many surprises. The city hosts one of the world's largest collections of Rabbie Burns material in the Linen Hall Library's Gibson Collection.
Today we're going to explore some of the treasures of the collection and find out what is down here in the first place.
I'm Ali, a writer for Scotland. With the help of librarian Samantha and other friendly Ulster faces, we're taking a deep dive into the content and context of the fascinating Gibson Collection and the Linen Hall Library itself.
So we are in the Linen Hall Library, described by the poet Michael Longley as the soul of Belfast. Its official name is the Belfast Library and Society for Promoting Knowledge. I think of the Linen Hall as Belfast's living room. It's a place to read, think, debate, form an opinion, change an opinion, and be part of a conversation that has been going on for centuries. So Robert Burns is part of the fabric of the Linen Hall Library. We have his statue. He features in a stained glass window. He looks down on us from his portraits on the wall. But of course, most importantly, in terms of Burns, is the Gibson Collection. Andrew Gibson was from New Cumnock in Ayrshire. He was one of the prominent Belfast Scots. He was president and vice president of various Scottish societies, including the Belfast Burns Club. It has been noted that he wished to own a copy of every edition of Burns in existence, and he created this incredible collection, which was valued and would have been worth in the region of £250,000 in today's money, was made available for sale at around half that amount, on the condition that it was available and used for the benefit of the people of Belfast.
Appetite whetted, it was time to explore. My Ulster Scots pen pal, broadcaster and blogger Mark Thompson joined me. Like Wayne's in a sweet shop, we roved the collection and picked each other out a few favourites. Mark began with Gibson's own journal of his collection.
Yeah, so Andrew Gibson is collecting Burns editions from all over the world. New York's in there, various places in Germany are in there, places in England are in there, of course, Kilmarnock, but there's about 3 pages of Belfast editions here, just meticulously listed. And so they're not kind of like second-rate copy editions or anything like that. This is Belfast as part of the Burns world, a part of that community who enjoyed his writing and his language and his speech just so much.
I was slightly fuming because my ain Bonnie Angus publishes less Burns editions in the Gibson Collection than bloody Belfast does. An outrage.
Well, it was massive here, and he's still treasured here. And you know, you'll come across. I mean, even in everyday speech, even though the posh, highfalutin folk get a bit sniffy when folks say I and we, you will still hear ordinary folk saying I and we all the time.
So you've actually picked out, Faye, the Gibson Collection. You've got James Orr there.
James Orr, the Bard of Ballycarry. On the one hand, he sings in praise to the potato, and he thinks potato is wonderful, and he is annoyed. He's annoyed. Well, we like our prutas or our spuds or our tatties, you know, we still like them. In the first verse, he has a go at tea, wealth, wasting tea. And the deeper he gets into it, the more Scots he becomes in his vocabulary. But then the very next poem, in the same edition, is entitled Tea, where he sings in praise of tea.
There's also some stuff that I hadn't ever seen before. So we ken ourselves, like we both have Scots language backgrounds. It isn't I seen as the most refined or the most highfalutin, as you say, language. It's been kind of dung down over the years by many people. This is the songs of Robert Burns translated fae Scots into Latin. Love it. Because that is saying this Scots poet is worthy of the most high status language in Europe at the time. Humble Ayrshire pluming laddie, Scots poet that means so much to us, also ringing into this other European lead to be enjoyed as far and wide as possible. Shows the power.
Aye.
We love him because he's kind of ours. But you can, like, these international editions show that his impact was so wide.
And Scots as a lead in its own right, not as a stepping stone between English and something else. It's on a par with other European languages.
But one of the ones I'm desperate to share is this lovely 1843 Paris edition, en français. So this is Burns set into French for a mid-Victorian era French market, right? I'm going to give you a wee dose of one of the more celebrated poems, and I'm going to see if you can tell us which one it is. Okay? I'll not give you the title because I give the game away. Right. Béni soit votre honnête et errante face, grand chef de la race de pudding.
Très bon. Très bon.
Et merci.
I suspect that might well be addressed to haggis.
It is en haggis. I love seeing this good, honest Scots poetry that we've enjoyed all our days being enjoyed by. You didn't get fancier than Victorian era Parisians, do you?
No, that is right. That is right. But that's his great strength, isn't it? He can appeal to the ordinary working folk as well as the high society. They get a bit of a buzz out of it too.
And that's the strength of the Gibson Collection, is it lets us in 2021 commune with all these different eras of the human past and the different cultures around the world as they responded to Burns, as we fragments of the whole.
Yeah. It was almost like he was trying to preserve a whole tradition and a sense of literary importance around all this. Well, the Linen Hall Library is one of Belfast's great institutions. It really is. You know, the walls in here are lined with stories and heritage and tradition that, you know, a lot of the time doesn't get the sort of mainstream coverage that it really should have. And, you know, perceptions of Belfast are very skewed because they're so limited. This is the full breadth, you know, the whole mix of all the diversity is in here. It's a wonderful place.
The Linen Hall doesn't just safeguard this heritage, it celebrates it. Events and outreach keep its collections at the fingertips of the younger generations. Young musician Sarah Carlyle experienced a Burnsian conversion at the Linen Hall, having grown up in an Ulster Scots community where the bard I bore the gree.
Well, everybody just sort of knows Robbie Burns when you talk about him. It's just sort of one of those things that holds a really, really special place. And I think that dates back to sort of the very, very early years of Burns' poetry being in Ulster. You know, there was sort of this idea that in a traditional Ulster Scots household 200 years ago, there would have been two books, Burns and the Bible. That idea of having something in your own language, in your own dialect, that you can just enjoy, and it doesn't have to be translated, you don't have to be particularly, you know, even into poetry to enjoy it. It's about everyday things, and it's using everyday images that everyone can relate to. When I was very, very young, maybe 7 or 8 years old, my dad took me to the Linen Hall one Burns night, and I walked in and sort of went, wow, this was like my idea of heaven, just books everywhere, old books, just the aesthetic. I absolutely loved it and still do. And then, you know, there was food and music, and I really enjoyed all of that. And they had a Burns impersonator who I sort of started getting the crack with, and he was asking me, you know, what are you doing here, more or less? I said, well, you know, I like Burns and stuff like that. So he asked me what my favourite Burns poem was, and I said To a Mouse. So he stood up and recited it for me then, and it made me feel really special, and I've always just sort of clung to that and really enjoyed it.
Love it, love it. Love the Linen Hall, keeping that connection going, broadcasting that Burns tradition. Can I put you on the spot? How much of To a Mouse do you remember?
Oh, very little, but I could read it if I had it, yeah. But mousey, thou art no thy lane, in proving foresight may be vain. The best laid schemes of mice and men gang after glee, and lay us not but grief and pain for promised joy. Still thou art blessed compared with me, the present only toucheth thee, but och, I backward cast my eye on prospects drear, and forward though I canna see, I guess and fear.
I've loved getting to know the Gibson Collection a wee bit better. There's so much there that's fascinating, interesting, insightful. You can explore so many different angles to Burns and the world's reception of him through that cracking collection. But the Linen Hall is the perfect place for all that to be kept as well, because they didn't just look after it perfectly, though they do. They make sure it's reaching out through events, through publications, into the next generation. So that thread connecting the old Scotch tune of the 1700s Belfast is strong right through to today and into the future.
A more recent visitor to the Linen Hall Library was the award-winning Scottish poet Stuart Paterson. A fellow Irishman, Stuart has a way of words all of his own, but remains an ardent fan of his fellow Ayrshire countrymen.
Thanks so much to the Linen Hall Library for asking me to contribute to this commemoration of 120 years of the Gibson Collection in the library. Andrew Gibson, an Ayrshireman. Rabbie Burns, an Ayrshireman. Me, Stuart Paterson, an Ayrshireman. I think it's a lucky thing to be asked to do. And my great-grandmother and my great-great-grandpa were Gibsons from the same area as Andrew Gibson, New Cumnock and Cumnock. So I don't think I'm related, but who knows what we're going to find out. And I've been asked to contribute my favourite Burns poem. And I think it's the favourite Burns poem of maybe billions of people round the world. Every hogmanay, millions and billions sing it and recite it. And Rabbie wrote it 5 miles from where I was standing here in Dumfries. Rabbie wrote it at Ellisland Farm by the banks of the River Nith. And he wrote so much up there, including Tam O'Shanter and the Ode to a Wounded Hare. But this is a poem which I believe Andrew Gibson, would have loved himself, would have sang it. And it's one that I love personally, for lots of reasons for Rabbie. And this is called Auld Lang Syne. Should old acquaintance be forgot and never brought to mind? Should old acquaintance be forgot and Auld Lang Syne? For Auld Lang Syne, my Jo, for Auld Lang Syne, we'll take a cup o' kindness yet, for Auld Lang Syne. And surely you'll be your pint stout, and surely I'll be mine, and we'll take a cup o' kindness yet, for Auld Lang Syne. For Auld Lang Syne, my Jo, for Auld Lang Syne, we'll take a cup o' kindness yet, for Auld Lang Syne. We twa hae run about the braes, and pu'd the gowans fine, but we've won it, money a weary fit, sin Auld Lang Syne. For Auld Lang Syne, my Jo, for Auld Lang Syne, we'll take a cup o' kindness yet, for Auld Lang Syne. We twa hae paddle in the burn, fae morning sun till dine, but seas between us braid hae roared, sin Auld Lang Syne. For Auld Lang Syne, my Jo, for Auld Lang Syne, we'll take a cup o' kindness yet, for Auld Lang Syne. And here's a hand, my trusty fear, and gie's a hand o' thine, and we'll take a richt good willie wacht, for Auld Lang Syne. For Auld Lang Syne, my Jo, for Auld Lang Syne, we'll take a cup o' kindness yet, for Auld Lang Syne. And for Andrew Gibson and for Robert Burns, for Auld Lang Syne, and who they are now and what they do for us still at this time. Cheers, thank you.
We have already heard a little from Mark Thompson this evening, but he has kindly agreed to join us live for a conversation with fellow Burns enthusiast, scholar and friend of the Linen Hall Library, Dr. Carol Baraniuk.
Thank you, Scott. Good evening, everybody. Greetings from what I call the Far East. I live in the most easterly townland of the entire island of Ireland. The townland's called St Andrews. It covers Ballyhalbert and Portavogie on the Arch Peninsula. And I'm very glad tonight to be having a conversation with Dr. Carol Baraniuk. So I'm hoping that Carol can hear me and that we can kick off a wee bit of a discussion for everybody.
Well, Mark, while we wait for Carol to hopefully rejoin us, perhaps you could give us a little bit of your background, what your connection is to the Ulster Scots language, what inspired your love of Burns.
Aye, certainly, Scott. Well, living where I'm at here in the Arch Peninsula, it is one of those areas where previous generations, and to a lesser degree my own generation, but have used Ulster Scots words the whole way through life, except in the classroom. You never ever used these words and figures of speech with informal situations, with teachers, with doctors, with fancy folk, with folk that you didn't know outside your own area. But for us, round about Hame, we would have used them all day, every day, if I could have got away with it. It was in Belfast this morning, actually. I went to St George's Market and I was talking to a friend of mine. He's one of the fish sellers from Portavogie. And very quickly he slipped straight into Diddy and Wadney and Cudney and Hinny and yeah, hey, a bit of that and so on. And whenever you know that you're among folk that aren't going to take a hand out of you, it's a lovely, lovely way to communicate with like-minded folk. I mean, it's not unique to here, because what I find is that everyday speech right across the province of Ulster is very, very heavily infused with Scots words. I realised that in particular whenever I started going out with a girl who was raised in England, and words that to me were just everyday speech, to her caused total bafflement. She had no idea. One of those that I'll maybe talk with Carol about later on is the word japped. Now, all of us, I think, would know exactly what that means. It means you've got a wee splash, you've got a wee dot of something that's landed on your clothes or on the wall. She had never heard the word japped before. And that's because it's not a standard English word. You have to go to something like the Hame tongue, James Fenton's marvellous Dictionary of Ulster Scots, or even an older source like the Scottish National Dictionary or the Concise Scots Dictionary, or the works of Rabbie Burns, to see words like jabbed actually defined and used in context. And there's so much of that all over the place. Like I said in the wee video there, I think everybody except those who are trying to be posh and fancy will say I for yes, will say we for small, and we're very familiar with these sorts of things. But once you get outside of Northern Ireland or Ulster and Scotland, you might struggle to be understood properly.
I'm in total agreement with you there, especially when it comes to what you learn in the classroom and what you're told is the proper way to speak, or the proper way to write. Like I said in my short introduction at the beginning there, I grew up speaking a very different, almost a different version of Ulster Scots, which I only discovered last year. I think the BBC had done like an oral history recording in the 1960s around the area, kind of the south bank of Lough Neagh, around what's now Craigavon, where they speak a dialect called the Munchies, which is something that I had never heard of. And I instantly recognized the words and the language that my grandparents spoke, which had always confused me because I knew that it wasn't what we would call standard English, but it also didn't ever seem to be standard Ulster Scots. Right. So do we come across, many of these varying dialects, across Ulster or indeed across Scotland?
Aye. Well, you're in a pretty unique part of the world there, Scott, but your point, about remembering, hearing words used is exactly what Seamus Heaney, the late Seamus Heaney, wrote in his fantastic poem, A Burl for Burns, which begins with, "From the start, Burns' burl and rhythm, the tongue the Ulster Scots brought with him, was in my ear." And he knew that hearing those words gives you a really powerful emotional connection, which opens doors into literature, into collections like the Linen Hall Library collection, the Andrew Gibson Collection. And suddenly you see a completely different universe when you hear it expressed and explained using these sorts of terms. Again, just while we're waiting for Carol to come along, one that I really enjoy, I've really enjoyed recently, is a poem by a man called Ernest Milligan. Now, he was a young son in the Milligan family. People like Alice Milligan are very, very well regarded today. Ernest isn't so well known because he didn't write just so much. But the Milligans had a holiday home at the end of the Stockbridge Road outside Donaghadee. Ernest fell ill for a while and he convalesced there for, we think, about 18 months. But even in the summers when Alice Milligan was down there, in one of her short stories that she published in Shan van Vocht, her periodical, she says that the speech of the locals was broadest county down Scotch. And Ernest was inspired by hearing some of the local folk using these words. And even though they were a well-off family and he had been educated at Queen's University, he was still soaking this up. So I'm going to try to recite this just off the top of my head. It's a poem called Ganging Up By. Now, ganging means going, and kai is the plural of coo. So a coo is a cow, obviously, but more than one coo isn't coos, it's kai. That's the plural of coo. So this is a romantic poem about a young fella who encounters a girl with her herd of kai, and eventually romance blossoms. So here we go. Now, this is literally off the top of the head.
Angela?
Here we go.
Angela?
By Portavoe Wood, as yen evening I came, I met with a sweet little lass who was driving her kai, and I held back the gate till all were cattle did pass. She turned and she thanked me kindly. Say bonny to see. I'm just ganging up hame to the byre, and I think I can manage, quoth she. Ganging up by, driving the kai, ganging up by on evening. The neighbours all smile when I'm ganging up by on evening. I wandered awa, but I hadn't got far till the lassie come rinning behin, all breathless and scarce she could speak. And quoth she, "Good sir, will you be so kind to help me fin all of my cattle?" she said. and drive them up hame fae the beach, through whan bush and bramall that he wandered awa on the rooks far out of my reach. I fun all our kine, our bonny silt kine, and brocht them up over the brae, and we joked and collogued as we doitered along, and at length to me she did say, though I never hae met such a weel-spoken lad, a strange laddie, I couldn't be seen. You'll hitty ask leave o' my daddy, said she, to bring him the kye o' name. Gin your daddy's dochter is willing, quoth I, I'll speak to your father himself. And I went way the last to the snug thatch at house where she wi' her daddy did dwell. I opened the latch, the upper door latch, and I called on the master within. He came to my call. A fine evening, said he. I was moitered just who to begin. I told who had given her a hand with the kye, and he brought me inside to the fire. And rich friendly we grew, while the lassie hersel was busy outside in the byre. Heth, it's old Fanny's son up ayont that ye are. Aye, you're welcome whenever you pass. If I'm nae about it's nae differ, said he. You can bide for a while with a lass. So I aye met the lassie o' evenings, and her bonny silk cattle brocht hame, and would bide for a while up near han the close one for an end to the byre we came. If it court, 'twas behave you're a blether, but I seen the love licht in her ee. 'Twas ever the way with that lassie, but I kent her heart full weel. Yon evening, says I to my dearie, to Canada soon I maun gae, for there's nocht to be made in this country. Who she cried and besought me to stay. Then she smiled and she whispered me shyly, I'll be fond and nae longer deny. So I married a dear wife that loves me, and we still drive our cattle up by. Ganging up by, driving the kye, ganging up by one evening. The neighbours all smile when I'm ganging up by one evening. That's Ernest Milligan, about 1907, written as a young man outside Donaghadee, and he's soaking up bits of vocabulary, and he's quite comfortable about incorporating that into his wee collection of poems. So, Carol, I think you might be back with us now. I was just trying to fill up a wee bit of airtime there until we resumed.
I think I'm unmuted now. Can you hear me now?
Yes,
okay.
We can indeed.
Good,
we can
good.
indeed, Carol. Very good.
Mark, that sounded like you were doing a great job. And I'm sorry I didn't hear the whole of it.
Oh, never worry, Carol. Never worry.
I don't know what happened there, but my connection just went. But with the help of Angela, to whom I must say thanks, and also my good husband, who has a lot of IT expertise, I'm back with you again. So
very good. Well, it's lovely to see you, Carol. And you and I, of course, we've crossed paths a few times over the last, 10 or 15 years or something, but we've never actually had a proper one-to-one conversation like this before. So I'm certainly looking forward to this.
Yes, me too. Now that I'm here and able to talk.
Well, I've done a wee bit of an introduction for the audience, Carl, about my background here in the Arts Peninsula and growing up here in Ulster Scots being used, and of course the view across the Scotland. I mean, I can see the Mall of Galloway every single day, at least on a clear day. But at night, I can see the lighthouses twinkling, and there's folk coming and going between where I live in Scotland all the time. So, give us a wee bit of background to yourself.
Okay, well. As I think people probably know, I have the great privilege and pleasure of working on the Editing Robert Burns for the 21st Century project at the University of Glasgow. But my links to Burns go back a long, long way. My great-grandparents came from Brashane, near Ballymena, very much an Ulster Scots speaking area. And my great-granny was renowned in the family for her recitations of Burns poems. And my great-granda apparently wrote some poetry too, but of course, being an Ulster Scots family and very practical and so on, nobody thought it was worthwhile preserving any of his works, which I've always thought was a great pity.
Aye, absolutely.
But I suppose my first more direct contact with Robert Burns came on a family holiday to Ayr, and that must be the case for lots and lots of people from these parts. But we were staying in Ayr, and of course we made the trip to Alloway and went to see Burns's cottage. And I have very, very vivid memories from all those years ago, particularly of the pictures that there were around the cottage. And the one that really stands out in my memory is there was a large picture depicting the Cotter's Saturday Night, Burns's poem about family life and worship. And I remember the picture of the family and all the children sitting around the table while their father read to them from the Bible. And it was, I suppose it was the name, the Cotter's Saturday Night, that struck me, because I thought, well, sitting listening to the Bible being read to you isn't really how you expect a Saturday night to be. And in our house, we would have watched, probably a Western film on the TV. And my dad always brought sweeties home on a Saturday night, and we sat and ate them and watched the telly. We didn't have Saturday night Bible reading, so that I found quite striking. But when I went to do my degree in the 1970s, I went to Stirling. Again, so many young people, then and in all the years since then, have crossed from Ulster to Scotland to do their degrees. And that's a tradition, of course, that goes right back to Presbyterian minister candidates travelling to Glasgow to do their divinity studies. But I was fortunate enough to have as my first tutor a man called Donald A. Lowe, who was a young academic in those days, but rose to become extremely eminent in Burns studies. And he made me very conscious of Scots language used in the literature. And the thing that struck me again and again was, I know a lot of these words because people at home use this vocabulary too.
Aye.
And had an advantage over students maybe who had come from England to Scotland to study and who didn't have that familiarity with the language. So when I look back, it really almost looks like the path was laid out for me, because it has culminated, ultimately in getting involved in Ulster Scots literature, which was written very much in the Burns tradition, and then culminating in, as I say, the great pleasure and privilege of working on the Editing Robert Burns project, which will produce a multi-volume edition of the works of Robert Burns. And it has been so exciting to work on that and to work with so many really superb scholars from whom I've learned so much.
That's brilliant, Carol. That's brilliant. Well, I'm sure you've noticed that in behind me here, I have a wee, maybe 18 inches tall, bronze of the bard himself. Now, I have tried to electrify him tonight. I've tried to light him up a wee bit in the hope that that's what we were going to be doing, is trying to illuminate and bring him to life, perhaps in our conversation. I mean, much like you, I've so many family connections with Scotland, and it's not a far away place. It's just across there. And so I nearly studied in Scotland. I went to art college in Belfast, and I had the chance to go to 3 Scottish art colleges. In the end, circumstances meant I had to stay in Belfast. But it's probably a good job I did, because if I'd went to Scotland, I probably would have done no art college. I would have got into language and literature and history instead, and not touched the sketchbook at all for those 3 years. But it's just an extension of Hame, really, for me, because the folk are like us. The traditions and culture and language and literature we very much share across the water.
Well, are you going to give us a few notes on that mandolin behind you? Because I think you mentioned to me that there was a Burns song which used a tune that you were very familiar with.
There is indeed. Now, I know we're meant to be talking about words and literature and so on, but he was, of course, also a tune and melody collector, and his great collection, the Scots Musical Museum that he worked on around 1794, he wrote a note about this particular melody. Now, I'm going to jump around here because I've got a midden of books here that's just outside of shot to let some folks see. Now, this is the Edinburgh edition from 1787. I have a modest collection that is nowhere near the caliber of the Andrew Gibson collection. But I'm hoping that you might potentially just be able to make that out, because this is the second edition, which was dedicated to the noblemen and gentlemen of the Caledonian Hunt. A very august body in Edinburgh at the time. Now, the reason I'm showing you that is because it connects with the name of a tune that was called the Caledonian Hunt's Delight. And he writes this down in the Scottish Musical Museum. But here's the note. The note that he writes along with it says this. Now, and these are Robert Burns' own words. So now, to show you how difficult it is to trace the origin of our airs, I have heard it repeatedly asserted that this, the Caledonian Hunt's Delight, was an Irish air. Nay, I met with an Irish gentleman who confirmed that he had heard it in Ireland among the old women. But of course, there's a big Lowland Scots community in this part of Ireland, so it's totally natural that you're going to get all sorts of sharing. But he goes on and says, while on the other hand, a countess informed me that the first person who introduced the air into this country was a baronet's lady of her acquaintance who took down the notes from an itinerant piper in the Isle of Man. So already in this one tune, you've got Burns living not only in Scotland, but in a kind of a North Channel Irish Sea world where ideas and traditions and vocabulary and tunes are coming back and forward. I am going to try to play it because hardly anybody knows what the Caledonian Hunt's Delight is, but hopefully you will know it when you hear it. Because he used it for one of his most famous pieces. Caledonian Hunt's Delight, which of course he used for Ye Banks and Braes o' Bonnie Doon, a tune that Scott in his introduction there said that he used to sing when he was a wee fella. So I hope you're crying in the background there somewhere, Scott. But you know, the music and tunes and songs are just fabulous, absolutely fabulous.
That sounded really lovely on the mandolin, Mark. Really enjoyed that. Thank you.
That's great. I wasn't just sure how well the computer microphone was going to pick it up, so I'm glad that you got it. But you know, his reference in that description to a countess also gives me a very kind of an important Ulster point to make, because again, in that Edinburgh edition, the 1787 edition, there's a great big list of subscribers at the start, hundreds and hundreds of people who were so excited by the phenomenon of this new writer that they pre-ordered copies of the new edition that was going to come out of Edinburgh. One of those people is from Ireland because it gives their locations and addresses, just one of them. And I'm going to attempt to show you on screen here if I can, because her name was the Countess of Moira, and she was from Montalto House outside Balnahinch. She had pre-ordered 6 copies. Now, her name is the second on the list, just down here, the Countess of Moira, Montalto, Ireland, 6 copies. So he may have been a ploughman from Ayrshire, but he was totally at home in high society in Edinburgh, taking orders from people of that magnitude. I mean, she was a fascinating lady in her own right. She, I'm told, conducted the first ever scientific survey of a bog body, which had been found within the grounds of the estate. And also, of course, within the estate was the location of the Battle of Balnahinch. So very, very meaningful Ulster connection through just that one edition of his work.
Well, Mark, you clearly are on your way to being the new Andrew Gibson. All the bits and pieces that you have collected there, some really, really impressive artifacts and additions as well. I think as I've looked into Andrew Gibson's life and his work as a collector, I've been so impressed with the huge amount and the variety of Burns volumes and volumes of Burnsiana and memorabilia to do with Burns that he amassed. And it's been one of the joys of going into the Leadenhall Library to have access to that collection and to those works. And I think, I mean, obviously we're very proud of Gibson and what he gathered together and that we still have in Belfast, but his reputation extended back into Scotland as well. And there was a great exhibition of Burns's works and Burnsiana just towards the end of the 19th century in Glasgow, the 1896 exhibition. And Gibson was the only member of the committee that organised that exhibition who lived outside Scotland. And he also set up a subcommittee here in Ireland to gather important Burns works and artefacts and so on to be part of that exhibition. And he actually contributed to the exhibition a task that, you know, gave him obviously quite a lot of headaches in terms of just the logistics of getting his material there and getting it properly displayed and getting it back again. He contributed over 300 items. And the memorial catalogue of that exhibition, which the library has a copy of, and which Queen's University Library, just a short distance from the Leadenhall, also has a copy of that belonged to Gibson. If you go through those catalogues, you see again and again item loaned by Mr. Andrew Gibson of Belfast, and it really is striking to see how important he was to such a major exhibition, and how much esteem he was held in by fellow Burnsians. And he was also important to the very significant work of exposing forgeries of Burns manuscripts, which was a growing black market trade in those days. And Gibson was taken along to look at some of those manuscripts, and he was able to identify which were genuine and which were by the notorious Burns forger, Antique Smith. And he's described as one of his fellow Burnsians at the time, a Mr. Craib Angus, who was one of the executive members of that organising committee. He was described as a gentleman who knows his Burns down to his roots. So he really had a very significant stature, not only at home in Ireland, but also in his native Scotland. He was really recognised as an important Burns collector.
My goodness. Well, I mean,
that's something for you to aspire to, Mark.
Well, I don't know about that, Carol, but as you know, I have gathered up a whole of things over the years from various folk, from friends, and I mean, I don't know if Andrew Gibson, how he would have survived in the eBay era, because he would have been bankrupted overnight with the amount of stuff that you can easily get now from around the world. But there's a few things here actually that I'd quite like to show viewers that I have gathered up. Now, this is probably one of my most treasured things. A tiny wee letter. Now, this is an original letter, and it is, I need to be very careful with this because honestly, it is so delicate. It is so delicate. I hope, again, that the camera is going to pick this up, because This, I hope you can see at the top of the page. Scott's nodding, so I hope it's in focus. It is 2 York Road, Belfast. Saturday, September the 19th, 1845. And it is a letter written from York Road in Belfast. And you can see at the very bottom, Robert Burns Jr. He was in Belfast visiting his daughter who was living on the York Road. And the letter is written back to Ayr, to I think either his cousin or his sister, you would know, Carol, Isabella Begg. And he's writing to her saying, I'm coming home on Saturday. Can you lift me at the boat? And I would like to have my breakfast prepared too. Thank you very much. So it's very basic, very, very basic. But what a fantastic thing to have found from 1845. His daughter was called, I have to get this right, Eliza Everett. And she had been widowed relatively early in her marriage. And so she and her young daughter, Martha, lived in Belfast for about 25 years. There are all sorts of artifacts and things. And Martha, it is pretty well established that she was a friend of Andrew Gibson's. Now, this again is very frail. This is from 1896, but this girl here might look like a female Robert Burns, because that is Martha. That is the granddaughter, or great-granddaughter, sorry, of the bard who lived in Belfast for about 25 years.
It's the same eyes as in the famous Burns portrait, isn't it?
There is a real resemblance there, and it is amazing that they lived in the city for so long. And that, I think, just brings home how relevant it was for Andrew Gibson, an Ayrshire in Belfast, to also start collecting. He was a friend of the family. It was entirely natural that you would start to make those connections across the water.
That fascination with Burns in Belfast that your own collection speaks of is something that, well, ever since Burns started writing, it's been very evident here. And we know that certainly the radicals in Belfast, who were keen to change the political system here and to make life more equal and more democratic and so on, they were inspired by poems like, one of my favourites, Is There for Honest Poverty, known as A Man's a Man.
Yep.
For all that. And
give us a line or two, Carol. I'm sure you have that embedded in your memory banks.
Well, the rank is but the guinea stamp, the man's the gowd for all that. I love that. Rank isn't important. It's the man, the person, the individual who's important. And no matter what rank you are, you haven't any right to consider yourself more important than somebody, who is of a different class from yourself. And I think that's very much a Scots and an Ulster Scots view of things. It's certainly, I was brought up never to think too highly of myself, and also never to imagine that just because I'd got a bit of education or whatever, that in some way I was better than other people. Right. But that fascination with Belfast, I came across just the other day in a publication called the Belfast Monthly Magazine, which was printed in Belfast. I think William Drennan, the patriot and radical, was one of the editors. And in 1809, July 1809, there's a lovely little dialogue published, and it was commissioned for the Belfast Monthly Magazine. And it's a little dramatic dialogue between a father and daughter and son, mainly between the father and daughter, about Burns and the fascination that he exercises. And it begins with the father comes into the room and the daughter's reading, and the father wants to know, what is it you're reading with such intensity, he says. And then she reveals that she's reading Burns and that she just can't stop reading his prose and his poetry. So she's probably reading something like James Curry's Life and Works of Robert Burns, which prints his letters and his poetry. Yeah. And the father's maybe a wee bit concerned that his daughter daughter's getting so into this stuff. And he warns her, well, you know, he was a very good writer, but he was a bit too satirical and he could have turned people away from religion. And the daughter comes back, oh no, it was only hypocrisy that he satirized. He didn't satirize people with genuine faith.
Yeah.
So then the father worries a bit maybe that Burns was a bad example because you know, he was known for having all these bad passions and for drinking a lot and so on. And again, the daughter pipes up very strongly and defends him. And in the end, the father seems to back down and give way. And he turns to his son and says, well, Henry, you were in Scotland recently. Did you learn anything of Burns there? And Henry, the son, then gives a whole account of how Jean Armour Burns was doing, how she had been living since Burns died, and also the careers of Burns's sons, how they were getting on, and his sisters, and where they were living and what was going on in their lives. And you've a sense that people here wanted to know about Burns, they wanted to read his works and his poetry, but they were also really interested in the family life. It really was as if they regarded him as one of ourselves and wanted to know all the family news and family gossip.
Those words have power, Carol. You know, those words that you quoted there, they really do have power. And just the other day, whenever I, you know, knowing that this conversation was coming up, again, I opened up, you know, those early editions. And I mean, I went to a wee country primary school, and you could pretty much tack on here what you wanted to, because everybody was on the same page, and that was all good. Then I went to a fancy grammar school in Newton Ards, and all of a sudden, bang, you know, you're in a totally different cultural environment. And you learn very, very quickly that you can't talk like that around about here, anymore. You come back home and you can hear that vocabulary, and you start to live a kind of a split life. You know, there's your home life and there's your school life, and it's very strange. But yet, whenever you pick up Burns, and the first poem in the book is Twa Dogs, not two dogs, but twa dogs. And whenever you see a word that you aren't meant to be using anymore, in black and white, on a page, in a collection of world-renowned poetry, suddenly the person that you're not meant to be is instantly legitimized. And it's not even just the appearance of the word, it's the skill and the craft and the creativity, because twa dogs isn't just about twa dogs. It's about wealth and poverty, and these two dogs are having a conversation with each other. I mean, it's just an absolute masterpiece, and it's an incredible beginning to a collection for a wee country fella like me, and wee country boys and girls all over Ulster who need to know about this. That the parents, that the speech of their parents and their grandparents that they use at home is legitimate and is important.
Mark, what you're saying reminds me of something that Seamus Heaney once said. Seamus Heaney, the greatest Irish poet certainly of recent times, and he grew up on a farm, and then, as we all have to, was sent off to school. And he writes about being given a poetry book, and he opened it, and what was in the poetry book but Burns's poem To a Mouse. And he looked at the first line and he read, "Wee sleekit Karen timorous beastie, oh what a panic's in thy breastie." And there were words there, particularly the first word, "we," that he was used to using all around the farm with his family. And he speaks of that collapsing the distance between life at home, life on the farm, and the scholarly, more formal life at school. And suddenly he felt, you know, more at home at school. And also, I suppose it was a kind of epiphany for him, really. He realized literature could be in the language of the home, as well as in the formal English that school was normally associated.
Well, there's so much that we could say, Carl, and we better not, or you and I will be here we'll be up all night talking about these sorts of things that fascinate the both of us. I mean, you've not only from a personal perspective, but from an academic perspective as well. Me, it's just part of who I am and where I live, and I love sharing these things. Down here in the Arch Peninsula, about 100 years ago, there was a couple of historians in Portaferry, James Shanks and James McManus, obviously from two different backgrounds, but they have these wonderful written descriptions of how they both had this absolute love for the words and work of Robbie Burns. And if you then were to get on a ferry from Portaferry and go down into Lecale and Strangford, there's a lot of chat this year about the centenary of Northern Ireland in 1921. Well, in Lecale, a man called Leslie Montgomery, whose pen name was Lynn C. Doyle, published his book, An Ulster Childhood. And again, there's a brilliant, brilliant chapter in that book called Burns in Ulster about the cross-community appeal and usage of so many of these words. I'll read a wee bit, and I'm really super conscious of time, but I think this is class. He talks about a neighbour called Paddy Haggerty, who was a worker on the family farm. And he introduced Leslie Montgomery to the works of Burns. And after Paddy quoted it, Montgomery writes this: "When the poem was finished, I had become with Paddy a devotee in the worship of Robbie Burns. I was wrapped in the discovery that thole and snash were real words and that I might use them in future without shamefacedness." That's 100 years ago, and it's still that has that power now to do that for us today too.
Well, Mark, that's great. It wouldn't be me if I didn't finish off with a mention of the Burns of Ulster, James Orr. And I don't know if people can see the picture of Orr's cottage there, which is not unlike Burns's cottage. It would have been very similar, I'm sure. And James Orr, the greatest of the Ulster Scots poets, who wrote in the Burns tradition, but did different and original things himself with it. But he has a great poem, an elegy on the death of Mr. Robert Burns, the Ayrshire poet, and it really conveys his admiration for Burns and his sense of grief on the loss of Burns to the world at the ridiculously early age of 37. So I'll read a couple of short extracts from Orr's elegy on the death of Mr. Robert Burns, and I think that'll probably be my last word on the subject. He says, oh Burns, the wail of swains, with thee the Scottish music fell." It's the day the music died, as far as he's concerned.
Yeah.
"Till nature change, thy artless strain shall last and seem her second cell. Was pain thy theme, or pastime daft? Thou raised the roar, or moved the tear. Thy wood notes wild were sweet and soft, as grace divine to souls sincere. O Scotia, bards of note you've reared, e'en kings were counted of their train, but lo, a barefoot Merlin heard, for their pipes the praise has ta'en. Whate'er before so finely felt, so strongly marked your rustic rings, what moping mine unapt to melt, was Cowrife when he swept the strings. In times to come, though now obscure, his line may flourish for his sake, and sons a sang from mony a shore, cleave relics for his plough or brake. Sublime yet simple, wile yet wise, he ne'er was matched from Scotia morns. A noble peal convulsed the skies, 'twas nature's cell, respecting Burns.
Terrific, Carol. Absolutely terrific. We could talk all night.
We could.
All night, and we better know because folk hate their beds to go to. But it's been great, Scott. Thank you so much for facilitating this, and to all the viewers, I hope you've enjoyed it. I've certainly enjoyed it, and thank you very much for tuning in.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. I've really enjoyed the privilege and pleasure of talking about Burns too.
Thank you very much, Carol and Mark. We have another couple of short items to treat you with this evening. We've got some poetry and some, well, live music, but pre-recorded live music, because we can't be in the library tonight. So I hope you'll be able to stick around for that, and just bear with me for a second while I try to very seamlessly jump back into our pre-recorded section. Thank you, Mark and Carol. The Ulster Scots collection is at the Linen Hall Library, or a living archive, and Ulster Scots is in itself a living language, changing and adapting to the modern world. The library recently held an Ulster Scots writing competition, and author Angela Graham, one of the winners, has kindly joined us this evening to read from another classic piece of Burns.
John Anderson, my Joe, John, when we were first acquaint, your locks were like the raven, your bonny brow was brent. But now your brow is belled, John, and your locks are like the snow. But blessings on your frosty pow, John Anderson, my Joe. John Anderson, my Joe, John, we climb the hill together, and many a canty day, John, we've had wi' ane another. Now we mun totter down, John, and hand in hand we'll go, and sleep together at the foot, John Anderson, my Joe.
Although the Gibson Collection is primarily formed of the written word, the work of Rabbie Burns has often been set to music, and we will round off this evening with a short performance by County Armagh bluegrass outfit Capo Joe. Before that, however, we'll raise a virtual glass to Rabbie Burns and to Andrew Gibson, to Carol, Mark, Dan, to Stuart and Angela, to Jade and to Capo Joe for their contributions this evening. I'd also like to thank the Ulster Scots Agency for their support, and all of you who registered and came along this evening. We couldn't run these events without your support, and I'd like to extend an invitation to you to all visit linenhall.com. There you can view our upcoming programme of events, find out more about becoming a member of the library, and continue your exploration of the Gibson Collection. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and we hope to see you all again soon. Thank you.
Song in the Good stuff. Scott, is that us done for tonight?
That is us done for the night. I hope you all really enjoyed it. I had a lot of fun putting together this program, and huge thanks to absolutely everyone involved in making it. Everyone contributed really great stuff, and thank you all for doing your bit, and thank you all for coming along tonight and hopefully enjoying this celebration of the 120th anniversary of the acquisition of the Gibson Collection. Hope you've all learnt a bit about Burns, a bit about Belfast, and a bit about the Linen Hall Library. And I wish you all a bra weekend. Have a good one, and I'll see you all again soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Scott.
Thank you.
Scott, cheers, and thanks everybody for belting in, logging in, and taking part. Great stuff.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks to everybody.